Thomas Bridger, a retired park ranger living alone in the Colorado mountains, wakes one morning and senses something unusual in his cabin. His bedroom carpet is smeared with crimson, and the hallway window is shattered. Following the blood trail, Thomas drops to his knees and shines his flashlight beneath the bed. There, he discovers a badly injured female bobcat hiding in the shadows. Protocol says he should call the authorities, an outcome that could mean euthanasia. But staring at the creature bleeding out on his floor, Thomas makes a decision. Not today. He carries her to his kitchen table and begins a desperate hands-on fight to keep her alive. Months later, what she does shocks everyone. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The silence of the Colorado Rockies in late October is a heavy physical thing. It is a silence made of granite, pine needles, and the thin, crisp air that precedes the first true snows of winter. For Thomas Bridger, a 72-year-old retired park ranger, this silence was usually a companion. It was the reason he had bought the A-frame cabin at the end of a forgotten fire road 3 years ago, after his wife, Eleanor, had passed. He wanted a place where the world stopped shouting. But on this particular Tuesday morning, the silence was broken not by sound, but by a smell. Thomas woke with the jarring sensation that something was fundamentally wrong. The sun was just beginning to bruise the horizon with purple and gold, casting long, skeletal shadows across his bedroom floor. He sat up, his joints popping with the familiar stiffness of age, and inhaled. It was the metallic copper tang of fresh blood. His first thought was that he had a nosebleed, a nuisance of the high altitude and dry furnace heat. He touched his upper lip. It was dry. He swung his legs out of bed, his bare feet seeking his slippers, but instead, his heel landed in something wet and warm. Thomas recoiled, reaching for the lamp on his nightstand. The yellow light flooded the room, revealing a scene that made his ranger instincts scream to life. A trail of crimson smeared across the hardwood floor, leading from the hallway into his bedroom. It was a chaotic, dragged smear, indicating a heavy loss of fluids. His eyes followed the trail backward. The window in the hallway, the one facing the steep slope of the ridge, was shattered. Shards of glass glittered on the rug like diamonds. Something had crashed through with tremendous force. Heart hammering against his ribs, Thomas moved not with the speed of his youth, but with the calculated caution of his training. He reached into the nightstand drawer, bypassing the revolver he kept for bears, and instead grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight. If an animal was hurt, a gun might be necessary, but light was the first requirement. He followed the blood trail back into the bedroom. It ended abruptly at the foot of his heavy oak bed frame. Thomas dropped to his knees, ignoring the protest of his arthritic patellas. He clicked the flashlight on and swept the beam into the darkness beneath the mattress. Two eyes, glowing with a terrified emerald luminescence, flashed back at him. Thomas froze. It wasn't a domestic cat, and it certainly wasn't a dog. The creature was huddled in the far corner against the wall, its body heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. The distinct tufts on the ears, the ruff of fur around the cheeks, and the mottled pattern of the coat were unmistakable. It was a bobcat. And looking at the pool of darkening red spreading beneath her flank, Thomas knew she was dying. "Easy, girl," Thomas whispered, his voice rough with sleep but steady. "Easy now." The bobcat let out a low, guttural growl that ended in a wet cough. She bared her teeth, ivory needles in the flashlight beam, but she didn't strike. She couldn't. She was too weak. Thomas sat back on his heels, his mind racing. He knew the protocol. He had written the citations himself for 30 years. Do not interfere with wildlife. Call state parks and wildlife. Let nature take its course or allow professionals to euthanize. If he called the authorities now, he knew exactly what would happen. They would arrive in a truck, assess the severity of the injury, which looked catastrophic, and they would put a bullet in her or inject her with pink solution. It would be the mercy kill. It was the logical, legal thing to do. Thomas looked at the blood on his carpet. He looked at the shattered window where the creature, in a panic of pain, had sought the only shelter she could find. She had come to him. Whether by accident or some desperate instinct, she had come to his house. He thought of the empty years since Eleanor died. He thought of the cold, clinical nature of protocol. Not today, Thomas muttered to the empty room. Not in my house. Thomas moved into a mode he hadn't accessed in a decade. The stillness of the retiree vanished, replaced by the urgency of the medic. He went to the utility closet and retrieved his old field trauma kit, a dusty orange box he kept stocked out of habit. He grabbed a pair of thick leather welding gloves from the wood stove hearth and a heavy wool blanket. When he returned to the bedroom, the Bobcat hadn't moved. Her eyes were half closed now, the fight draining out of her with every drop of blood. I'm going to hurt you before I help you, Thomas said softly, approaching the bed. I'm sorry about that. He needed to get her out from under the bed. Reaching in, he expected an explosion of claws. Instead, there was only a weak hiss. He threw the blanket over her head to blind her and dampen the panic, then scooped her up. She was lighter than she looked, mostly fur and bone. She was young, perhaps a year or two old, not yet fully grown, but no longer a kitten. As he lifted her, she let out a sound that broke his heart. A high-pitched, confused mewl that sounded entirely like a house cat asking for its mother. He carried her to the kitchen table, which he had lined with clean towels. Under the bright overhead lights, the damage was clear. It was a gunshot wound, a .22 caliber, likely from a poacher or a rancher protecting chickens miles away. The bullet had entered the rear flank, tearing through muscle and grazing the hip bone. But miraculously, it seemed to have missed the vital organs and the spine. The exit wound was jagged and ugly, clotted with dirt and glass from the window. She was in shock. Her gums were pale, almost white. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" Thomas murmured, his hands moving deftly. He didn't have sedatives. He had to rely on her exhaustion. He flushed the wound with saline, the water running pink into the towels. The Bobcat twitched violently, her claws extending into the blanket, but she didn't bite. It was as if she understood, on some primal level, that this pain was different from the pain of the bullet. This pain was clean. Thomas worked for 2 hours. He cleaned the debris, cut away the matted fur, and packed the wound with antibiotic ointment. He stitched the worst of the tear, his hands trembling slightly, not from age, but from adrenaline. He administered a subcutaneous injection of fluids, leftover from when his old retriever had kidney failure, hoping the saline would boost her blood volume enough to keep her heart beating. By the time the sun was fully up, flooding the cabin with hard, bright light, the Bobcat was bandaged and sleeping a deep, comatose sleep in a large dog crate Thomas had set up in the corner of the living room. Thomas sank into his armchair, his hands covered in dried blood, and wept. He wept for the cat, for Eleanor, and for the sheer, overwhelming relief of having a life to save. The first week was a vigil. Thomas slept on the sofa next to the crate, waking at every rustle. He named her Grace, not because she was graceful, for she was currently a stumbling, broken thing, but because her presence felt like an unearned forgiveness for his years of solitude. Grace's recovery was not a straight line. On the third day, she developed a fever. Her body burned, and she refused the raw turkey Thomas offered on immense tweezers. She lay panting, her eyes glazed. Thomas mixed a slurry of water, electrolytes, and high-calorie nutritional gel. He put on his heavy gloves, opened the crate, and carefully syringed the fluid into the side of her mouth. She growled, a low rumble that vibrated through his hand, but she swallowed. "I know," he soothed. "I know it tastes like chalk. Drink it anyway." On the fifth day, the fever broke. Thomas woke to a sound he hadn't heard yet, the sound of chewing. He peered into the crate to see Grace tearing into a piece of venison he'd thawed from his freezer. When she saw him, she paused, a strip of meat hanging from her mouth, and stared. She didn't hiss. She simply watched him, her amber eyes clear and intelligent. "Good morning, Grace," he whispered. She blinked, a slow, deliberate closure of her eyes. In the language of cats, it was a gesture of trust, or at least, a cessation of hostilities. As the weeks turned into a month, the dynamic in the cabin shifted. Grace outgrew the crate. Thomas, knowing he was breaking a dozen state laws, opened the crate door one evening while he was reading by the fire. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on his book, his heart rate spiking. He heard the soft thump of paws on the rug. Then silence. For an hour, she was a ghost. He knew she was moving. He could feel the displacement of air, hear the faintest scratch of claws on the floorboards. But she stayed out of his line of sight. Then he saw her. She was perched on the back of the sofa 6 feet away, watching the flames in the wood stove. Her bandage was gone, the fur growing back in a darker patch over her hip. She moved with a slight limp, a hitch in her gait that might never fully heal, but she was strong. She looked at Thomas. He looked at her. "You're allowed on the furniture," he told her. "But don't scratch the leather. Eleanor loved this sofa." Grace yawned, exposing a terrifying array of teeth, and tucked her paws under her chest. She fell asleep to the rhythm of his breathing. Winter hit the Rockies with the force of a sledgehammer. Snow piled up 4 feet deep against the cabin walls, turning the world into a monochromatic landscape of white and gray. The roads were impassable for days at a time. In any other year, this isolation would have crushed Thomas. He would have spent the days staring out the window, measuring the hours until he could sleep again. But this year, he had a roommate. Grace was a creature of contradictions. She was wild, possessing instincts that no amount of kindness could erase. If Thomas dropped a pan in the kitchen, she would vanish instantly, reappearing only when the silence returned. If he moved too quickly, she flinched. She was not a pet. She did not like to be touched. Yet she was also intensely social. She followed him from room to room. When he cooked, she sat on top of the refrigerator, watching the steam rise from the pots. When he watched television in the evenings, she lay on the rug, batting at the dust motes dancing in the light. One afternoon in January, Thomas was napping on his bed. He woke to a weight on his legs. He opened his eyes carefully. Grace was curled up on the duvet, resting against his shins. Her body heat radiated through the blankets. It was the same bed she had hidden under, bleeding and terrified 3 months ago. Now she claimed it as her throne. Thomas lay still for an hour, terrified that moving would break the spell. He watched the rise and fall of her flank, marveling at the sheer improbability of it. A retired ranger, a man sworn to keep wildlife wild, was now the guardian of a predator who snored softly in her sleep. He realized then that she had saved him just as much as he had saved her. She had given him a schedule. She had given him a worry. She had given him a presence that demanded he be present too. But as the snow began to recede in March, revealing the brown earth and the first shoots of green, a heavy stone settled in Thomas's gut. He watched Grace pace in front of the sliding glass door. She chattered at the squirrels running along the deck railing. Her muscles rippled beneath her coat. She was healthy. She was strong. And she was a prisoner. "I know," Thomas said to her one evening, watching her stare at the moon. "You don't belong here, Grace. You belong out there." She turned to look at him, her head cocked. She rubbed her cheek against the glass, leaving a smudge. Keeping her was selfish. It was dangerous, not just for him, but for her. If she lost her fear of humans entirely, she would approach the wrong house next time. She would be shot, and this time, there would be no ranger to save her. He had to give her back. The decision was made in April, on the first day the temperature broke 50 degrees. Thomas prepared carefully. He didn't just open the door, that would be irresponsible. He needed to take her deep into the backcountry, far away from roads, ranches, and guns. He brought the old crate out. Grace looked at it suspiciously. She remembered it as the place of confinement and pain. Thomas placed a piece of raw steak inside. "Trust me, girl," he said, his voice cracking. It took 20 minutes, but she eventually stepped inside. Thomas closed the latch with a finality that felt like a door closing on his heart. He loaded the crate into the back of his pickup truck and covered it with a tarp to keep her calm. The drive was long, 2 hours of winding dirt roads that climbed higher and higher into the San Juan Mountains. He drove to a place he knew from his working days, a valley rich with hair and shelter, miles from the nearest hiking trail. When he killed the engine, the silence of the mountains returned. It was the same silence as before, but now it felt hostile. Thomas carried the crate to the edge of a meadow lined with aspen trees. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin. He knelt by the crate. Through the wire mesh, Grace watched him. She wasn't growling. She was waiting. "Listen to me," Thomas said, leaning his forehead against the metal. "You stay away from houses. You stay away from people, you hear me? We aren't all like me. Most of us are dangerous." He took a deep breath, fighting the stinging tears in his eyes. "Go on, Grace. Go be a ghost." He unlatched the door and swung it open. For a long moment, nothing happened. Grace stayed in the back of the crate. She looked at the open door, then at Thomas. She let out a soft murp sound. A question. "Go," Thomas commanded, waving his hand toward the trees. Grace stepped out. She placed her paws on the damp grass, her nose working overtime, taking in the sense of 1,000 different things. She stretched, her spine arching. She took a few steps, then stopped and turned back. She looked at Thomas standing there, an old man in a flannel shirt, his hands hanging uselessly by his sides. She held his gaze for 10 seconds, an eternity. There was no sentimentality in her eyes, only recognition. "I know you. You are the safe place." Then the wind shifted, carrying the scent of prey. Grace's ears swiveled. the wild took hold. She turned and broke into a run, her powerful hind legs propelling her over a fallen log. She vanished into the tree line without looking back. Thomas stood there for an hour, waiting, hoping, and dreading that she might return. But the forest had swallowed her whole. He drove home in silence. The cabin felt massive when he returned. The food bowl in the kitchen was a painful reminder. He put it away in the cupboard, cleaned the litter box one last time, and sat in his chair. The silence was back, but this time it wasn't empty. It was filled with the knowledge that somewhere, miles away, a heart he had mended was beating under the stars. Summer passed slowly. Thomas occupied himself with projects he had neglected. He fixed the deck, he painted the shed, he chopped wood for the coming winter. He tried not to look at the ridgeline every time he went outside. He assumed he would never see her again. That was the deal. Successful rehabilitation means the animal disappears. But the bond between them was not so easily severed by geography. It started in late August. Thomas found tracks near his woodpile. They were too small for a mountain lion, too large for a house cat. He told himself it was just a coincidence. Bobcats were territorial. Maybe another one had moved in. Then, in September, he was sitting on his porch, drinking his morning coffee. The air was turning crisp again. Movement at the tree line caught his eye. He froze. There, sitting on top of a granite boulder about 50 yards away, was a bobcat. She was silhouetted against the dark pines. Thomas slowly raised his binoculars. He focused the lenses. There was a faint scar on the right hip, a disruption in the pattern of the fur. "Grace," he whispered, his breath catching. She wasn't approaching the house. She was keeping her distance, respecting the boundary he had set. She sat there for 10 minutes, simply watching him. She looked magnificent, sleek, well-fed, her coat thick and glossy. She was the queen of her domain. When she was satisfied that he had seen her, she slipped off the rock and disappeared. It happened 3 more times that autumn, always at a distance, always silent. It was a check-in, a nod between old friends. She was letting him know she was alive, that his work had mattered. Then came the heavy snows, and he didn't see her for months. Spring arrived late that year, following a brutal winter that had buried the mountains. Thomas, now 73, felt the cold more deeply in his bones. He moved a little slower, tired a little faster. One morning in May, the world was exploding with life. Birds were screaming their territory songs, and the meltwater was roaring in the creek. Thomas was in the garden planting peas when he felt he was being watched. He stood up, wiping the dirt from his hands, and looked toward the forest edge. Grace was there. She was closer than she had ever been since her release, perhaps only 20 feet from the edge of the garden fence. But she wasn't alone. Tumbling around her paws, wrestling with the tall grass and each other, were 3 balls of spotted fluff. Thomas dropped his gardening trowel. Kittens. Grace stood still, her eyes locked on Thomas. She let out a low chuffing sound, and the kittens froze, looking toward the noise. There were 3 of them, clumsy, blue-eyed, and perfect. Grace nudged one with her nose, guiding it slightly forward, as if presenting them to him. The message was clear, transcending any language barrier. Look what you did. If Thomas hadn't pulled her from under the bed that bloody morning, if he hadn't cleaned her wounds and fed her through the fever, these 3 lives would not exist. The lineage would have ended on his bedroom floor. Tears streamed down Thomas's weathered cheeks, hot and unashamed. He didn't move. He didn't want to frighten them. He just stood there, a witness to the enduring, beautiful cycle of life. Grace watched him for a moment longer. Then, with a flick of her ear, she turned. She let out a sharp command, and the three kittens scrambled after her, tripping over their own paws as they followed their mother back into the safety of the trees. Thomas watched until the last tip of a tail vanished. He sat down on the garden bench, surrounded by the smell of wet earth and growing things. The loneliness that had plagued him since Eleanor's death was gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace. He wasn't just an old man in an empty cabin anymore. He was part of the mountain. He was part of the story. That night, Thomas slept soundly. He left the curtains open, letting the moonlight spill across the floor where the blood had once been. He didn't need to worry about the silence anymore. He knew that out there in the darkness, the forest was alive, and a part of it carried his love in its beating heart. Years later, hikers in that part of the Rockies would sometimes report seeing a bobcat that didn't bolt immediately at the sight of humans. They described a large female who would pause, watch them with intelligent, calm eyes, and then slip away. They called it a ghost of the mountain, a legend. But the locals knew better. When they found Thomas Bridger passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 80, they found a photo on his nightstand. It wasn't of a person. It was a grainy, zoomed-in picture taken from a porch, showing a scarred bobcat and 3 kittens in the morning light. On the back of the photo, written in shaky handwriting, were 3 words: Grace, Hope, Life. The rangers who cleared the house noted something strange. In the dust on the outside of the bedroom window, the one closest to where Thomas had slept, there were fresh paw prints. A witness had come to say goodbye.